I hereby call this meeting, Norwood City Council, to order. Please rise for the prayer and pledge of allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in these council chambers. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we may do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Moore, would you please swear in Mrs. Hoover?
Absolutely. I'm your designated swearing guy. Ready?
Right, sir.
I state your name.
I, Susan Hoover,
Do hereby swear
do hereby swear
to support the Constitution of the United States
to support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
and the Constitution of the State of Ohio,
and do faithfully, honestly, and impartially
and do faithfully, honestly, and impartially
discharge the duties of the office
discharge the duties of the office
of Counsel at Large
of Counsel at Large
of the Norwood City Council.
of the Norwood City Council.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you. Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci.
Here.
Mrs. Hoover.
Here.
Mrs. Lake.
Here.
This is with me, all these new people. Mr. Kelch.
Here.
Mr. DiNardo.
Here.
Mr. Thompson.
Here.
Mr. Braden.
Here.
All members present. Moving on to item E, amendment of agenda. We have 3 items to add this evening. Item L5 will be the ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. We'll be adding L6, resolution to accept the material terms of the July 2021 Jansen National Opioid Litigation Settlement Agreement and declaring an emergency. And we have in the whereas, we have a date of 2022, that should be 2021. And then the final item to add is communications, item P5, which is Mayor Schneider's mayor's court fines. Mrs. Lake.
Move to amend the agenda as stated.
Motion by Mrs. Lake. Mr. DiNardo.
Second, please.
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Mrs. Lake.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item H, request to address council. We have one request this evening. We have Bishop Sonny James.
Good evening. First, let me say that it is great to be alive and well. Second of all, I want to commend all of those who have faithfully served our community and done so to the best of their God-given ability. And we want to welcome all of those. After the people have spoken, we want to welcome all of those that are stepping up to serve. There have been many challenges over the last several years, but I strongly believe that we are making strides each and every day to accomplish a common goal. And that common goal, for me, is to see that our community embraces everyone and that everyone is given an opportunity, as I've said before, not to always have to work under status quo, but to be able to come forward and to be embraced equally with every equal opportunity. And so in the coming year, as we start off planning with our community partners, our second annual Martin Luther King Day celebration and parade, I want to welcome all of our Norwoodians to come and participate. Last year, it was absolutely phenomenal. We intentionally did not invite many of the outside community just because of the heightened stresses. And so I intentionally kept the numbers low so that we could have a peaceful, exciting parade. We didn't call it a march intentionally because then folks during that time last year were looking to get excited and tear up a few buildings just for some recreation. And so we found it best to just keep it small. This year, we are looking to expand it a little bit more, but I'm really excited to welcome all of our Norwood families to this wonderful celebration, and I'm really, really excited about it. I also want to extend gratitude and appreciation for what we're going to acknowledge tonight on the agenda. You know, the Bible tells us to give honor to whom honor is due. And when people serve our community, we really owe them something. And so I stand in agreement and applaud any opportunity we have to tell somebody thank you, and we appreciate you, and we appreciate your service. My press for 2022 is that we embrace everyone that comes forth with genuine ideas and opportunities that we can help each other really launch Norwood like it really deserves to be launched. We've got some awesome, awesome people in Norwood, just like in many other communities. And as I now take another step along my journey, I'm really challenged to try to do things in such a way that my fourth grade daughter can say, "Daddy, I'm very proud of you." And so we can challenge each other, to press each other to be better human beings, to be better people, to not judge as much, but to really love each other. And let's work together to get rid of all of those nasty rumors that have plagued our community for decades. And I want to stand before the people of God and all of my peers and honestly say, if I've ever said or done anything to offend anybody, if it were a lie, I apologize. If it were true, I'm asking you to just, let's get on with it, make the changes that need to be changed, and let's love each other so that every child in all of our schools will look at us and say, my God, I'm so glad I grew up in this era. And so, welcome to the new faces. We say not goodbye to the old faces, but we say, you know, carry on the good work. Continue to strive to make our community great, because it takes all of us, including me, to really make a difference. God bless you all, and let's get ready for 2022 and go MLK Day. Let's come on out and show the children that we all can work together. God bless you all. Happy holidays, and I pray all of you be well and healthy. Peace.
Thank you, Bishop James. That's the only request we had to address council this evening. Moving on to item I, reports of standing committees of council. We did not have any to report out. Item J is the third reading of ordinances and resolutions. We don't have any this evening. Item K is second reading of ordinances and resolutions. We don't have any as well. So we'll move on to item L1. Item L1, ordinance amending section 1321.25 of the Norwood Codified Ordinance to allow murals in neighborhood business districts. Mr. Thompson.
Move we have all three readings of this ordinance.
We have a motion by Mr. Thompson to have all three readings. Mr. Donato.
Second.
Second by Mr. Donato. Any discussion? Mr. Thompson.
So, the mayor called me today and asked me to explain this in case he hadn't been able to show up by this time, but he had a meeting with the Arts Board, and the Arts Board requested this slight change to the existing ordinance. What it does is it adds neighborhood business districts to the existing mural ordinance. What that's going to do is we've got a couple of folks who've been trying to have murals on their properties for years now. Mr. Hoff has had his covered up with the tarp for a very long time. This would allow folks in those few areas of town be able to proceed with their murals. So he asked if I would just explain that. And this is supported by the Arts Board. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Anyone else? Any further discussion? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have all three readings?
Ordinance amending Section 1321.25 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances to allow murals in neighborhood business districts. Ordinance amending Section 1321.25 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances to allow murals in neighborhood business districts. Ordinance amending Section 1321.25 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances to allow murals in neighborhood business districts.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake,
I move that the ordinance be passed.
motion by Mrs. Lake to pass the ordinance. Mr. DiNardo.
Second, please.
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Mr. Kelch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know when we first kind of passed this ordinance, we talked about revisiting it, and I guess that's what we're doing now. If this current council we have here so wishes to pass this, then so be it. I'm going to be against it. The residents that had voiced their opinions to me back when we passed this initially and had this battle, that was widely publicized and over quite a few meetings. They still oppose it at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and back those residents that oppose it, as I did before.
Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Anyone else? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
No.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
No.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting, we have 5 ayes, 2 noes. Motion passes. Moving on to item L2, ordinance amending ordinance number 14-2021 and adding the non-union unclassified positions and salary ranges for deputy treasurer, administrative assistant, and recreation assistant, part-time hourly, and declaring an emergency. Mr. DiNardo.
I'd like to have all three readings of this.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo, have all 3 readings. Mr. Thompson?
Second that.
Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Motion by Mr. DiNardo, second by Mr. Thompson. Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. May we have all 3 readings, Mrs. Williams?
Ordinance amending ordinance number 14-2021 and adding the non-union unclassified positions and salary ranges for deputy treasurer, administrative assistant, and recreation assistant, part-time hourly, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance amending ordinance number 14-2021 and adding the non-union unclassified positions and salary ranges for deputy treasurer, administrative assistant, and recreation assistant, part-time hourly, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance amending ordinance number 14-2021 and adding the non-union unclassified positions and salary ranges for deputy treasurer, administrative assistant, and recreation assistant, part-time hourly, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. DiNardo.
To pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. DiNardo to pass the ordinance. Mrs. Lake.
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Lake. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
I think somebody had a question.
I just
Mr.
want to, if I could, through the chair, to Mr. Bernardo, kind of see if this has been talked about with Mr. Stith and the state of Ohio people that are kind of looming.
Yeah, I don't know actually if it's been talked about in the state of Ohio. I think that this puts the ranges so that we could kind of have that same fidelity that we have on the other positions. So all the other positions have like, you know, the low and the high, and you can go within 10%, the first 10% without approval, and then you have to require approval. This sets the ranges. I actually don't know if we really talked about with anybody else, but I don't know if it really changed anything.
Thank you, Mr.
Someone else could help answer. I don't know if we talked about this thing.
Mrs. Lake.
My understanding was that, in speaking with Mr. Stith, that these establish the positions. It doesn't necessarily fill them. And anything that would be added would have to go through the Financial Planning and Supervision Commission. This simply establishes the range as every other employee's range. Mr. Bonsall, I'll go through the chair and ask if Mr. Bonsall or has anything else, or Mr. Moore to add.
Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I would just, Mrs. Lake is exactly right. In order to put it in the financial recovery plan for next year, we need to establish a range that it will go in the plan, so that's what this does.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Thank you, Mr. Kelch. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item L3, ordinance declaring that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins Avenue and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way. Mr. Dracy.
I'll make a motion to have all three readings.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to have all three readings. Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to ask permission, I guess, from the council, or if I need to make a motion to allow the family to speak during our discussion, if that,
Sure.
Mrs. Lake?
I just would ask, would you like the first reading in its entirety, so everybody can,
yes.
so,
Can you amend your
I'd like to amend the motion to have the first reading in its entirety.
motion by Mr. Geraci to have his first reading in its entirety? Mr. Kelch? Mr. Kelch will amend his as well. Mr. Geraci? Did you want to?
If any of the family would like to speak, you can come on up and speak about Tony.
We can take the microphone.
we'll bring that
Yeah, you can stay.
Stay sitting.
Thanks, Chris.
There you go. Try to knock you over. There you go. It's pretty. Get like real close.
I just think it's how I can say this, a great honor for my dad. What you're doing tonight. And I just wish my mother and my sister could be here so they could see it too. But thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Geraci?
Just a little bit about the backstory, and this is what I found from Jeffrey Gladish, who posted, I guess this was posted on the Cincinnati Norwood Police page. So around June 20th, between June 20th and about July 5th, there had been several armed robberies at pharmacies in the area of West Norwood. which is Ward 1, down on the Section Avenue, the Wayne Avenue area. In today's value, well, 2015 value, somewhere around $1,800, $485, and up around $2,000 in 2015 value. So the police chief, Charles Fritz, set up what was called an officer assignment at the time, or plainclothes assignment. And on the night of July 8th, 1942, Sergeant Overberg was supposed to have friends over with his wife to have a get-together. However, he was assigned to the Lawson's Drugstore, located at 4320 Franklin Avenue, which is now demolished, but it's the corner of Cortland and Franklin. He got there around 10 p.m., and within 10 minutes, the male that was suspected of these robberies had entered the drugstore. The male had pushed his way with the owner to the back of the store where Sergeant Overberg was posted, and a fight ensued for the suspect's weapon. Sergeant Overberg was able to get control of that weapon. Unfortunately, because his weapon was sitting on the table, the suspect grabbed Sergeant Overberg's weapon himself, firing 3 rounds, striking Sergeant Overberg 3 times. The suspect was then later caught in Chicago. This is Norwood's only police line-of-duty death. We're 80 years. We're coming up on 80 years this year, July 8th, 2022. This is something that I had planned since being elected. This is something that I hadn't mentioned to anybody that I was going to do. The plan was last meeting of the year this year to bring this up. So I wanted to make sure that Sergeant Overberg is not forgotten. I want new residents that come in, that see this sign, ask about who he was and what he did. We never want to forget legends. And that's one thing I think right now Sergeant Overberg is. There's many rumors out there as to what was going on. However, I think this story on the Norwood Police page tells the best story that's out there, putting everything together as to what occurred. And him being the only officer to be killed in the line of duty, I think we need to honor him. So when this ordinance is read, there's a lot of aspects to this ordinance instead of just the sign. And hopefully on July 8th, 2022, we can have a nice little celebration at the corner of Cortland and Franklin and install that sign and remember what he gave to this city 80 years ago. I'm trying not to get choked up. So hopefully we can get this passed tonight and get this underway for the family, and it's long overdue.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Anyone else? Mrs. Lake?
I just want to say it is long overdue, and thank you, Mr. Tracy, for doing this. It's a well-deserved honor, and I'm glad that you had the foresight that we didn't have. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Anyone else? Any other comments? Mrs. Hoover?
I would also like to say thank you. Apologies, I have bronchitis. I think that the history of Norwood is very important for us to always keep in mind. I want to thank you very much for sharing this with us tonight, and my condolences to the loss of your father. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. So thank you very much, Mr. Tracy.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoover. Mr. Brady?
Thank you, Mr. President. I first want to say what an honor it is to have the family here tonight. I appreciate you guys. An honor for you to be here, and I wouldn't know how to deal with that. I think this is a great gesture try to be involved in it. I do want to just talk about, this is our last meeting of the year, I think. I don't know if we're going to have another one. We may or may not. No, sometimes we cancel it. I didn't know. So anyway, I think I'm honored the family is here, and I'm just truly am. But rushing this through at the very last meeting, I don't know. I don't see any Ms. Lake, maybe you know more about this incident than I do, obviously. I'm not saying I completely support it. I just don't know if it's a good idea for us to rush through 3 readings. Maybe, I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm saying maybe we should discuss it a little further versus just have 3 readings and make sure we have all the facts.
Thank you, Mr. Red. Mr. Kells.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I also want to just, thank Mr. Tracy for bringing this to our attention, and definitely thank you, family, for being here. This is a story I didn't really know much about, and being a West Norwood kid my whole life, I mean, it's something that was just so long ago, to where somebody like me that's been here my whole life could, not hear of this story, and I think what Mr. Tracy's trying to do is make it out there, make it a talking point, honor this man and his family, and, somebody that went and paid the ultimate sacrifice, for our city. So, and it being in Ward 1, I definitely appreciate you bringing this, and I'll be in support.
Thank you, Mr. Kells. Anyone else? Mrs. Lake.
I've known about the story. I knew about Sergeant Overberg. I'm not sure how I found out about it, but it's certainly a legend around the community. In the police department, they all know about it, those who have been around for a while. We old folks, I resemble that remark. I can say that because I'm old. So for those young people who may not know or have heard of Sergeant Overberg, everything Matt read is true. And I'm just like bewildered why we didn't do something before. I mean, I really am bewildered, and it makes perfect sense. And so I thank you for, whenever a police officer leaves or whenever a firefighter leaves their homes, you never know whether they're going to come back. We complain about our little jobs sometimes, but they literally put their lives on the line all the time, and he literally gave his life for the city. And in a day and age when when a lot of police departments are not getting the best of press, and I think it's a wonderful gesture that we show something positive that happened. Somebody who gave the ultimate sacrifice. It certainly wasn't positive for you, but we take a positive step to acknowledge the sacrifice that he made and that your family made. And so I want to encourage everyone, I convey, the story's true, and I want to encourage everybody to pass this tonight. And I hope that, maybe in July when it's the 80th anniversary, we can plan something and have the rest of the police department there. I think it'd be a perfect opportunity at the 80th anniversary. So.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Mr. Tracy.
I did speak with Chief Kramer on Thursday regarding this, and he said he was going to try and make it if he didn't have any plans. So he was in support of this. He was extremely happy to hear that it was finally coming around. One thing I didn't mention in my story was I spoke with several people regarding this just to try and get a bigger backstory on it. And the one thing I heard from 5 different people was that his wife heard the sirens about, from what I'm hearing, for about 10:15, she heard the sirens, and her first response to the friends were, "Oh, he caught the guy. That's awesome."
Oh, wow.
Only to find out what had really happened, and that was heart-wrenching to me, coming from the police department, being an officer, being in those officer need assistance runs, and having to call several myself.
Wow.
Being in a fight for my life, I can only imagine what went down that night. And sitting here now, I'm getting chills just talking about it myself. But for a family to go through that and wait 80 years for some sort of recognition, and even 5 years ago when the police department put a monument over at the police department for him and went to his grave and celebrated the life that he had and on the 75th. You know, this was interesting to research further than what I had done in the past over the last few months. So it was good to hear the stories. It was good to communicate with people, and I think giving him that day and giving him an honorary street where he gave his ultimate sacrifice is the least that we could do for him and the family.
Thank you, Mr. Tracy. Anyone else? We have a motion on the floor by Mr. Geraci, a second by Mr. Kelch, to suspend the rules, have all three readings. The first in its entirety, the ordinance declaring that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins Avenue and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way. Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye, the motion passes. Mrs. Williams, may we have the first reading in its entirety, and then followed by the second.
Ordinance declaring that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins Avenue and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way. Whereas Anthony Overberg was raised in Norwood, graduating from St. Elizabeth School, attending St. Elizabeth Church, and joined the Norwood Police Department on January 16, 1941. And whereas on July 8, 1942, having been promoted to sergeant, Anthony Overberg was working undercover at Lawson's Drug Store at 4320 Franklin Avenue in response to a string of robberies in Norwood. And whereas when an armed man attempted to rob the pharmacy, Sergeant Overberg struggled with the suspect despite obvious peril to himself. And whereas during the struggle with Sergeant Overberg, the suspect's firearm was knocked to the ground, but the suspect gained control of Sergeant Overberg's weapon, inflicting three gunshot wounds on Sergeant Overberg before fleeing the scene. And whereas Sergeant Overberg passed away later that night, and whereas July 8, 2022 will mark 80 years since Sergeant Overberg's line of duty death, which remains the only one in the history of Norwood. And whereas Norwood City Council now wishes to honor Sergeant Overberg's brave sacrifice and to honor the service and sacrifice of all Norwood police officers, past and present. Now therefore be it ordained by the Council of the City of Norwood, State of Ohio. Section 1, the Mayor and the City Council of the City of Norwood hereby declare that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way by legislative action of the Mayor and City Council in honor of Sergeant Anthony Overberg and in recognition of his contributions to the City of Norwood. Section 2, that the appropriate city officials are hereby authorized to do all things necessary and proper to implement the provisions of Section 1 herein, including the generation and installation of secondary street signage for the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, at the intersections with Hopkins Avenue, Cortlandt Avenue, and Sherman Avenue, in accordance with the Department of Transportation and Engineering's procedures relating to secondary street designation and related signage. Section 3, Council also requests that appropriate signs be placed and an appropriate ceremony conducted on July 8, 2022, at the intersection of the Franklin and Cortlandt Avenues. Section 4, Council declares that July 8th be recognized as St. Anthony Overberg Day each year. Ordinance declaring that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins Avenue and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way. Ordinance declaring that the street currently known as Franklin Avenue, specifically the portion located between Hopkins Avenue and Cortlandt Avenue, shall hereby receive the honorary secondary name of Sergeant Anthony Overberg Way.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Geraci.
I'd like to make a motion to pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mr. Geraci to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci.
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover.
Yes.
Mrs. Lake.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes.
Mr. President,
Mrs. Lake.
can I ask after the mayor and everybody signs this, that we provide the family with copies of this ordinance and maybe one or two framed, or are you going to take care of that?
I'm sending a proclamation to the mayor's office for him to type up and send to the family in a frame, as well as one for the police department to hang up.
Cool, man.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Thank you, Mr. Geraci. Item L4, ordinance accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council regarding city tax incentives for Quatman Corner Properties, Regent Realty, TST Cincinnati, Tri-State Urology Services, and Ventura Commons, and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Lake.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to suspend the rules and have all three readings. May I have a second? Mr. Braden.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Mrs. Lake.
I was a member of the Tax Incentive Review Council for a number of years as a representative of Hamilton County, and so every year the tax incentives that council has granted over the years have to be reviewed by that council, and they make recommendations as to whether or not those tax incentives should continue. And attached are the agreements, the CRA agreements that they reviewed, and it is the recommendation of that all of these be continued, with a couple notations that some of them have fallen short of their jobs numbers that they had hoped to generate, but I think, given the situation with COVID, we can let that, we can certainly understand that for this year. So I would encourage the other members of council to pass this ordinance and allow those CRA agreements to continue.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Any other discussion?
I have a
Mrs. Hoover.
I have a question, you might be able to answer this. With the, pardon me, who is in charge of following up with those, when they aren't meeting those goals? And is there discussion with the companies in terms of, are they making good faith effort to meet those goals?
Mrs. Lake.
Thank you, Mr. President. When I was on the Tax Incentive Review Council, the companies had to literally come before the council. They had to provide documentation to us, and we could review it. And as you can see in the agreements, some of them are real property investments, and then others are jobs, and then others are a combination of the two. And so the company has to provide that information probably about 3 or 4 months before the council, whenever the Tax Incentive Council meets. They ask that information be submitted to them so that the council and the members of Hamilton County can review the information. If there's any deficiencies, then they're discussed at a meeting. And like the one was supposed to be 70 jobs or something, and I think it's still in progress. And so they just remind them that part of the agreement is that they still have a jobs numbers to meet. But the companies have to provide all that information to the members of the council. And I think there used to be 3 members that were county representatives, and then there were 2 or 3 from the city. I don't know if that's still the case, but it's a good number of people who put eyes on the information that is sent.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Thank you, Mrs. Hoover. Mr. Moore?
I hate to interrupt, but just as a point of reference, from our perspective, for most of these projects, it's really not been about job creation. It's been about property that's in really horrible shape, and here's an incentive for somebody to finally, or it's been empty for a long time, like, do something with it. But under the Ohio Revised Code, the agreements are required to have some number for current jobs, jobs you expect, full-time, part-time, and those kinds of things. And those numbers, quite honestly, come from the companies. But for the most part, it's not really, the fact that anybody is going to be using the old pawn shop on Williams Avenue, awesome. We don't care if they create 2 jobs or 15 or whatever it is. It's just like somebody actually actively fixing that up and using the property from the city's perspective anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Anyone else? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Lake, second by Mr. Braden, to suspend the rules and have all 3 readings of the ordinance accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council regarding city tax incentives for Quatman Corner properties, Regent Realty, TST Cincinnati, Tri-State Urology Services, and Ventura Commons. Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover,
Yes.
Mrs. Lake.
Yes.
Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo.
Yes.
Mr. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
All members present voting aye, the motion passes. May we have all 3 readings, Mrs. Williams?
Ordinance accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council regarding city tax incentives for Quatman Corner properties, Regent Realty, TST Cincinnati, Tri-State Urological Services, and Ventura Commons, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council regarding to city tax incentives for Quatman Corner properties, Regent Realty, TST Cincinnati, Tri-State Urological Services, and Ventura Commons, and declaring an emergency. Ordinance accepting the recommendations of the Tax Incentive Review Council regarding city tax incentives for Quatman Corner properties, Regent Realty, TST Cincinnati, Tri-State Urological Services, and Ventura Commons, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake?
Move that the ordinance be passed.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to pass the ordinance. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo? Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy,
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover,
Yes.
Mrs. Lake,
Yes.
Mr. Kelch,
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo,
Yes.
Mr. Thompson,
Yes.
Mr. Braden.
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye, the ordinance passes. Moving on to item L5, ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
Suspend the rules and have all 3 readings?
Motion by Mr. Thompson to suspend the rules and have all 3 readings. Mr. DiNardo. Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion?
I'll have a discussion after.
I'm sorry, Mr. DiNardo.
I'm going to wait to have a discussion until after we see if we're going to have all 3 readings. I guess, Mr. Bonzo, I know this is mostly a Mr. Stiff thing, but it seemed like there's a bunch of movements around personnel changes. Probably to true things up at the end of the year. Is that right?
Mr. Bonzo?
Yes.
Putting down the spy, I know you're not Mr. Stiff.
No, you're fine, you're fine. I don't get these packets anymore, so thank you, Mr. Moore, for sharing that with me. Yeah, I mean, so this specifically, a lot of these are just TIF funds and various things that are on this one. You're probably at the, you may have one more, though, at the end of the year that you will have it, but for this is, and I think Mrs. Lake might be able to comment more, is more kind of fixing up the TIF funds for the most part.
Thank you, Mr. Bonzo. Mrs. Lake?
Thank you, Mr. President. If you remember when we did the, what's it called? We did an ordinance where these were decreased, and then we had to accept the rates and stuff that came back from the county because we estimate how much the tips are gonna be. And so we decreased them a certain amount, and then Mr. Stiss said, when we get the right amount, we'll be giving you the correct numbers. These are the correct numbers.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake.
It's part of the tax budget. Ooh, it just takes a little while for the gray matter.
Hey, James.
Anyone else? We have a motion on the floor by Mr. Thompson, a second by Mr. DiNardo to suspend the rules and have all three readings of the ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. May we have all three readings?
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2021 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. Thompson,
Move we pass the ordinance.
motion by Mr. Thompson to pass the ordinance. Mr. DiNardo,
Second, please.
second by Mr. DiNardo. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The ordinance passes. Moving on to item L6, resolution to accept the material terms of the July 2021 Jansen National Opioid Litigation Settlement Agreement and declaring an emergency. Mr. Thompson.
Before we address this, I would like to ask if the law director could give a brief explanation of what the details of this ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. Most of council should remember that earlier this year, you passed something similar to join a giant class action, the One Ohio version of a settlement against some of the distributors and manufacturers of opioids. And the logic around that was we're going to get some money. It may be $80,000, it may be $150,000, it may be $200-some thousand over the terms of the settlement that can primarily only be used going forward to address opioid issues. It's treatment, it's education, that kind of thing. With, even if we can't find a way to use it, maybe we can give it to the county for their, or the, some of the treatment centers. It can't hurt for them to send us the money. It's kind of the logic there. And Tim and I are not going to be suing any of the opioid manufacturers. We're not doing that lawsuit. Yesterday, the Ohio Municipal League sent an email saying, hey, hurry up. You need to approve the Johnson & Johnson one too. And today I got access. It was a long, involved, stupid process to actually get the terms of the thing that I would actually fill out. I didn't get that till today, so I'm sorry this wasn't on your desk until today. We have until January 2nd to do this, so I hope council will pass it. It's a similar kind of setup. I don't know what the numbers are going to be, and they are, the actual settlement agreement is some 200 pages. And there's very, very complicated math on how the money gets divided up amongst all of the states and then all of the subdivisions, depending on who all is in and who all is out, and if there's enough numbers and all the rest of that. So I have no idea what the dollar amounts would be here, but it's essentially the same kind of thing. We're not going to sue the Jansen family of companies, and we can get into some of whatever the remuneration is from them. And it's essentially the same kind of purposes, mainly primarily opioid treatment and prevention going forward as opposed to reimbursement for costs in the past. But there's a little wiggle room in the language. We'll just have to see how that plays out. And I'm assuming the state's going to tell us what we have to do anyway when that time comes.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Moore.
hope that answers what everybody wants to know.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mrs. Lake.
Move we suspend the rules and have all three readings.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to suspend the rules and have all three readings. Mrs. Hoover.
Second the motion.
Second by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? No discussion? Mrs. Williams, please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. May we have all three readings, Mrs. Williams?
Resolution to accept the material terms of the July 21, 2021 Jansen National Opioid Litigation Settlement Agreement and declaring an emergency. Resolution to accept the material terms of the July 21, 2021 Jansen National Opioid Litigation Settlement Agreement and declaring an emergency. Resolution to accept the material terms of the July 21, 2021 Jansen National Opioid Litigation Settlement Agreement and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake.
Move that move that the resolution be passed.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to pass the resolution. Mr. DiNardo?
Second, please.
Second by Mr. DiNardo. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The resolution passes. Moving on to item M, administrative reports. Mayor Schneider is not here, so we'll move on to item N, unfinished business. Do we have any unfinished business this evening? No unfinished business? We'll move on to new business. Any new business this evening? Mrs. Lake?
I am embarrassed to say that there are two firefighters who were injured, who were killed on the line of duty, one of which was a very good friend of mine, Bobby Plugman, and we have not honored them. And so, Mr. Geraci, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention, and I would ask that if I do some background work, if the law department can prepare those two ordinances, and we'll figure out what streets perhaps where they passed away or where they lived. And credit to Mr. Geraci, thank you. So I'll help with that background information and get that to you, and maybe we can do it at the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Any other new business this evening? Then we'll move on to communications. Communications. P1, Duke Energy regarding the adjustment to rider AMRP rates, case number 21-1036-GA-RDR. Mrs. Williams. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson.
That we receive this file it as of read.
Motion by Mr. Thompson to receive and file item P1 as if read. Second by Mr. Kelch.
Yes.
Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item P2 from Mayor Schneider. Appointment, the Norwood Planning Commission, 6-year appointment.
Letter dated December 3rd, 2021, to Mr. Bernie, and I'm going to kill this last name if someone knows it. Sewer. Okay.
Sewer, yeah.
2554, now I know, instead of trying to pronounce some of these last names, I just ask everyone else. 2554 Indian Mount Avenue, regarding appointment, Norwood Planning Commission, 6-year appointment. Dear Mr. Sewer, I am pleased to appoint you to the Norwood Planning Commission beginning January 1, 2022. Your term will expire on December 31st, 2027. Thank you for accepting this position, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake.
Move that the letter be received and filed.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to receive and file the letter. Mr. DiNardo.
Second, please.
Second. Mrs. Lake.
Just in the way of background, a member of the Board of Zoning Appeals, the BZA, there has to be one member of the BZA that is on the Planning Commission, and the person who is that appointment now has finished their term, and so Mr. Sewer has agreed to be that representative from the Board of Zoning Appeals on the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake. Please call the roll.
Mr. Geraci?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item P3 from Mayor Schneider regarding appointment of the Norwood's Art Board for a 3-year appointment. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated November 30th, 2021, to Ms. Carrie Atkins Morris, regarding reappointment Norwood Arts Board 3-year appointment. Dear Mrs. Morris, It is my pleasure to appoint you to the 3-year term to the Norwood Arts Board, effective December 31, 2021. Your term will expire on December 31, 2024. Thank you for accepting this position, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. DiNardo. Motion by Mr. DiNardo. Mr. Thompson? Second by Mr. Thompson. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. Motion passes. Moving on to item P4 from Jim Stith Auditor, closeout of 2021 POs. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated 12/1/2021 to all department heads. As we approach the end of the year, each department must close out all open POs which will not be used by the end of the year, or by year's end. POs from 2021 cannot be used for purchases in 2022. The amount of open POs at year end will affect your available budget for 2022. As of today, the city has a total of $6,130,802.91 in open POs. This number must be reduced to below $350,000 by December 31st, 2021. If you have ordered an item or started a project, please consider decreasing the PO to the amount ordered. Close out all other POs in your department. As of today, no new POs will be processed until the end of the year. Emergency POs may be approved only by the auditor or deputy auditor on a case-per-case basis. Please review your expense report with encumbrance detail or your encumbrance report by account in VIP or ask for copies from the auditor's office. Sincerely, Jim Stith, Auditor.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mr. DiNardo. Motion by Mr. DiNardo to receive and file the letter. Mr. Braden.
Second.
Second by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. Moving on to item P5 from Mayor Schneider regarding Mayor's Court. Mrs. Williams.
Letter dated December 6, 2021, to Ken Miracle, President, members of Norwood City Council. Mayor's Court finds. Dear Mr. President and council members, enclosed, please find the report for Norwood Mayor's Court for the month of November 2021. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Sincerely, Victor Schneider, Mayor, City of Norwood.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Lake.
Move that the letter be received and filed.
Motion by Mrs. Lake to receive and file the letter. May I have a second? Mr. Kelch.
Second.
Second by Mr. Kelch. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present, voting aye. The motion passes. Item Q, all members are present, so we'll move on to adjournment. May I have a motion for adjournment? Mr. Thompson.
Move that we adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Thompson. May I have a second? Mr. DiNardo. Please call the roll.
Mr. Dracy?
No.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Mrs. Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Kelch?
Yes.
Mr. DiNardo?
Yes.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting. We have 6 ayes and 1 no. Motion passes. We are adjourned.